Something that comes up frequently in our conversations with clients is risk in the final mile or final courier section of delivery to patients. That last mile is often the most volatile and least controlled segment of the pharmaceutical supply chain. As the industry shifts towards more high value, temperature sensitive, and patient specific therapies, failures in this segment directly impact product integrity, regulatory compliance, and most critically, patient outcomes. What we're going to talk about today is how you can evaluate risk in your final mile and courier shipments, what important sorts of countermeasures or mitigations you can put in place to reduce those risks, and where we most often see those risks in the final mile of the supply chain. We're going to map this against BSI's MESH methodology, which stands for mapping, evaluation, strategy, and harmonization, to best see how we can sort of mitigate those risks in the supply chain. First, we look at mapping. Where does the risk concentrate in the final mile of your supply chain? Last mile flows are often fragmented with multiple handoffs, limited transparency, and a number of different partners involved depending on where you operate within the world. So in places like the United States, it may be a little bit less fragmented because there's a few primary distributors that you may be using, whereas in places like Europe or Asia, there may be a broader range or type of pharmaceutical distributors that you're using. What we see as hotspots in this area are areas like courier handoffs without any kind of verified chain of custody, urban delivery delays, which increase dwell times outside of the sort of environments that you can control, like a warehouse or cross-dock. And then we also see that direct-to-patient shipments lack standardized delivery conditions, especially in places outside of the developed world. So if you're delivering medicines in places like sub-Saharan Africa, for example, maybe parts of India, if you're trying to distribute there, we often see less controlled conditions there. Of course, it's really essential that people get medicines in those places, but we want to make sure that it's in as controlled an environment as possible. For example, you may have a specialty biologic that's shipped to a patient, but it sits unrefrigerated after a failed delivery attempt with no real-time alert to trigger any kind of intervention. This also means that it's more vulnerable to diversion, to theft, to other types of risks and threats as well. In order to help hedge against these risks, we encourage our clients to map end-to-end flows down to that final delivery node, including all third-party touchpoints and any environmental exposure risks that could increase the risk of theft, diversion, or other types of issues happening with the pharmaceutical shipment. Moving on to the evaluation phase of MESH, we sometimes see that risk is maybe underestimated a bit in different parts of the supply chain. So traditional models of risk that fail to capture that sort of dynamic and patient-critical nature of last mile risk are inevitably going to underrate some of the risks that you may face. One thing that we often see clients struggle with is that value in the final mile. They see that it may be the least value in the final mile, but also it's closest to the patient. So in some ways, it has a higher than monetary value to the overall supply chain. So as I said, any individual last mile shipment is not going to be as valuable as a medium mile or first mile shipment, but that means you can sort of systematically underrate the risk that you see in last mile, and the types of thefts or issues in that part of the supply chain can really begin to add up and have a direct and immediate impact on patient health and safety. So what we typically ask for and what we typically want to work with our clients on is a more nuanced view of risk in that last mile. How do we do that? We want to see that if we generate sort of predictive insights into any types of delays and types of issues along those routes, develop escalation triggers that are tied to patient impact. So for shipments where there is a direct and immediate impact on patient health or patient safety, we want to make sure that that gets escalated first. For example, if there's a time-critical oncology therapy that's delayed due to a local logistics distribution issue, but it's not flagged as high priority because it follows a kind of standard delivery protocol or hasn't been flagged as a high risk or high criticality shipment. What we want to see there instead is trying to implement more dynamic, multi-factor risk scoring that incorporates the sensitivity of the product itself, the criticality of the patient, and real-time disruption signals. So not just looking at the risk of theft in the country where that last mile is located, not just looking at the total value of the shipment, but taking into account all the other factors that can contribute to poor patient outcomes as a result of those last mile delivery failures. So moving on then to the third part of MESH, which is strategy. You want to have a strategy to design for control and resilience of your supply chain. So you want to have that kind of efficiency-led last mile model that exposes your critical vulnerabilities that you can then strategize around with the rest of your business. What we typically see here are sort of an over-reliance on kind of standard parcel networks for high-value therapies. So going through your big players for these kinds of final miles, rather than a more specialized or specialty provider, we sometimes see insufficient temperature control during those extended delivery windows, which also, of course, makes them more vulnerable to different types of theft and diversion. And then, of course, we see the actual exposure to theft itself in those high value and high risk areas. So for example, maybe in a place like India where it tends to get very hot, very humid, sensitive vaccines experience temperature excursions during that last mile that wouldn't occur in other parts of the supply chain without any kind of active monitoring or escalation. Or you may see that high value drugs are specifically targeted to theft due to predictable delivery patterns in a place with a high risk of theft like Mexico, Brazil, or South Africa. It's really critical here to develop strategies that make sure you can harden those different parts of the supply chain, understand a bit better where those risks may lie, and get better visibility into what's happening at each point of the supply chain. So you may put in place countermeasures like GPS tracking, you may put in place different types of temperature monitoring, but you need to make sure that all of those systems work together with an escalation tree and a plan to deal with and intervene in cases where there's an issue with one of those areas. So for example, one thing you could look at is things like segment delivery models. So using white glove or high level of service for really critical therapies or really patient critical therapies, or deploying different types of smart packaging with real-time monitoring, but making sure that you're building in that escalation trigger so you have a way to actually respond if there's something that happens in one part of the supply chain. Too often we see companies design their mitigations around different silos or different types of discrete examples and aren't looking at what would happen if there were multiple of those risks coming to the fore at or around the same time. So there's the external facing part. What are you doing to protect your supply chain and your cargo? But then there's the internal facing piece of what are we going to do with that? And what are we going to do with that type of information? So one way of sort of taking a more organizational approach is to develop some redundancy with multi-carrier strategies, place stock closer to where your patients are going to need the medicines, and then strengthen chain of custody and use tamper-evident controls on the packaging of the medicine itself in order to understand if those packages have been tampered with. So rather than looking at a single mitigation in isolation against a single type of risk, you're layering these strategies so that even if one of them fails, you still have multiple layers of protection for your last mile shipments. So once you've built that map of the supply chain, evaluated where the highest risk is, it should then be a bit easier to implement those strategies in your highest risk or most critical lanes for the last mile. As we all know, resources aren't unlimited, and so there will have to be some prioritization. Mapping the supply chain, evaluating where the highest risk is, allows you to do that. Lastly, where we see a lot of companies fall down is with these sort of point solutions, as I mentioned earlier, a particular point in time for particular high risk lanes, but then they don't harmonize those across the rest of the supply chain. Their efforts to build out risk management in that last mile don't scale, so they're only using it on their most high risk lane. Really, those types of methodologies could work well across different types of lanes also, and then it becomes much more difficult to sustain that risk reduction over a longer period of time. So sometimes what we see is that there's fragmentation across different logistics partners, there's fragmentation across different regions, there's fragmentation across different products, even though they have the same level of risk. So one country may be doing one thing that may work, another country is doing a different thing that may work for that country, but doesn't scale necessarily to other parts of the supply chain or other places where there is a high level of risk. Some of the challenges we see here are things like inconsistent standard operating procedures and processes across different 3PLs or different distribution partners that you may be using, or, as I mentioned earlier, across different geographies. We may also see, even if everybody is on the same page on your supply chain, there's disconnected data streams. So people aren't looking at the same data sources to see if they even should intervene or how they should intervene in the supply chain if there is a risk. They're not able to effectively track location of their shipments. They're not able to effectively track incidents that are occurring in relation to their shipments of the supply chain. And they're not able to effectively track temperature even for the shipments where there may be some sort of temperature tracking in place. And then you have these weak feedback loops. So even if something does happen, there's no way to sort of pull that information back into the business and quickly design and implement a mitigation plan. It's really critical to build those out beforehand and before technology or other types of solutions are applied to the supply chain. So for example, you have a shipment that arrives after a temperature excursion or arrives after it's been pilfered at an earlier part of the supply chain, depending on where that sort of shipment is going, and there's not proper escalation of that. You only see it at sort of the very end of that last mile. For example, there may be a temperature excursion that's handled differently by different types of regional partners, or a theft that's handled differently by different types of regional partners. And then you're not comparing sort of the apples to apples in your supply chain to understand where that risk may be and where you need those sort of stronger feedback loops. There may be places where you have really good reporting and you think that the risk is there, but again, you only see that risk because there's really good reporting on that particular part of the supply chain. Again, it's really critical to think about your blind spots as you go through and sort out and spread your strategy, scale your strategy across the rest of your business and across global supply chains. It's really important to standardize those global SOPs for handling, monitoring, and the different types of exceptions and incident management. integrate your partners into some sort of unified control tower where you're able to talk to them all at a rapid or at least a speed that allows you to intervene really effectively. And more importantly than that, or really as importantly, is sharing that visibility across the supply chain. You also need to have data standards and understand from each of your 3PLs, each of your distributors, and even internally within the business, what types of data you'd like to have shared with you, when you'd like to have that data shared, and what would constitute an incident, deviation, or excursion for these different types of data so you can respond consistently across your supply chain. So the other thing you want to do is once that's been established, implement really tight closed loop CAPA processes to continuously reduce risks with individual partners. So you're not just taking each supplier as a one-off or each incident as a one-off, but you're making sure that you're really tracking through those issues to closure, making sure that you're taking the lessons learned from those and applying them more broadly across the entire supply chain. To sum up, what we see with last mile logistics is that it's actually a patient risk, not just sort of a business or monetary risk. And we also see that just visibility without action is not really sufficient. A lot of companies will focus really heavily on getting as much visibility as possible into the supply chain, but then to forget to build in escalation triggers or planning around what they do with that visibility. You need that sort of real-time intervention capability and capacity in order to intervene in the supply chain if there is an issue or a potential issue before it becomes a problem at delivery, and build that relationship with your partners in order to effectively intervene before something becomes a problem. The other key thing we see is that third-party orchestration is really, really important for managing last mile exposure. You may be able to manage one 3PL or one distributor well in one country. You may be able to manage a particular region well, but you need to be able to do that consistently across regions. Again, the harmonization aspect of that, or else you're going to see problems in particular areas or particular parts of the supply chain begin to manifest themselves in different ways because your countermeasures that work in one region may not work in another. So organizations that invest in mapping, evaluation, and monitoring of their supply chain, and then harmonization of a similar strategy across their supply chains will reduce both cost and risk in their last mile delivery efforts and ultimately preserve patient health and do the thing that is most critical for the pharmaceutical supply chains, which is make sure that they can deliver to patients on time with the medicines that they need.